Hey you! I'm so happy you decided to start learning Japanese with me. My name is Taka, and let's begin this lesson with yokoso. Yokoso. Because yokoso means welcome. In this course for absolute beginners, we'll be studying basic phrases in Japanese. Now, if you want to be able to say them, I count on you to repeat after me every time we study a new one. So let's start with the greetings. Greetings in Japanese is aisatsu. 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 Just to make it easier, I'm showing the Romaji, but please don't rely on it too much, because what can happen is that you'll be reading it with the American intonations. Konnichiwa, for example. The stress is not at the same spot. Konnichiwa and konnichiwa. Can you tell the difference? Konnichiwa and konnichiwa. You'll probably come across content about pitch accents. In Japanese, we call that kote accento. Kote accento. And it's slightly different than the English stress because it's not just one stressed syllable, but kote means high and low. So each syllable will either be high or low. And it's debated if it's relevant to learn it as a beginner, knowing the fact that the accent changes a lot from one region to another. So I would not recommend worrying about it too much. If you listen and repeat, you should be fine. That being said, you've studied hiragana with me, and you might notice that the last character is not wa, but ha. There is a historical reason for that, but this is not a history lesson, and so I'll just give you a short answer you'll have to remember. When ha is used as a particle, it's always going to be pronounced wa. What is a particle? Well, Japanese is what we call an agglutinative language. That means you add affixes to words in order to give them an additional meaning or their purpose in the sentence. Wa is called the topic particle, and if I had to translate it literally, it would be as for. It's very similar to the subject particle, but it's also different. If you've studied a little bit of Japanese, you might have heard watashi wa, watashi wa, watashi wa at the beginning of sentences to say I. And it's not exactly the case, as subjects work a little bit differently in Japanese, and because you can get rid of them when they're obvious. But you might be wondering, why is there a topic particle to say hello? Well, that's because konnichiwa doesn't really mean hello, but today, or as for today. That's because it's the shortened version of the sentence konnichiwa gokigen ikaga desu ka, which means how are you feeling today? As time passed, the sentence was shortened to the first bit konnichiwa. I'll emphasize on both levels of formality and politeness because one thing you should know about the language is that humility is a big deal, and having manners has a great importance in everyday interactions. Now that you know the origin of konnichiwa, you should know when to use it properly. It's actually the equivalent of good afternoon in English, so you'll use it between noon and sunset. If you want to say good evening, that'll be konbanwa, konbanwa, konbanwa. Same thing here, ha is read wa for exactly the same reason, because the original sentence was konbanwa gokigen ikaga desu ka? Konbanwa gokigen ikaga desu ka? So we've just learned how to say good afternoon and good evening, but you also learned how to say today and tonight. But just a little clarification. Konnichi used to be pronounced like that, to say today, but now the language has evolved, and with the same kanji or Chinese characters, we would read them kyo, kyo. You remember when we studied the hiragana? When u is placed after o, it makes a long o sound. There is a more formal variation that is honjitsu. 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 That's what I mean by the importance of formality in Japan. It's like having two words to say today. So if you absolutely wanted to literally translate how are you feeling today, we would use kyo or honjitsu. Kyo wa gokigen ikaga desu ka? Honjitsu wa gokigen ikaga desu ka? All this to say that konnichiwa is now usually written in hiragana and will only be used in this context to say hello. So that was the first word. I'm just kidding. We'll go faster from now. But I believe it's relevant to explain a little bit about the culture and the history behind the Japanese language, as it's so far from English as opposed to Spanish or German that use the same alphabet. Konban, however, is also used to say this evening. Konban. Konban. I know that in English the distinction between night and evening is a bit blurry in the sense that there is a moment after sunset when you can use them interchangeably, like in the sentence, I'm having people over tonight. In Japanese, I believe the distinction is a bit clearer, so I would say that konban is from sunset to around 11 p.m. and then after that it becomes konya, konya. Though you would still use konbanwa to say hello until around midnight. I guess that's also a gray area in every country. But in the morning, you would say ohayou gozaimasu. Ohayou gozaimasu. Ohayou gozaimasu. You can see that the structure of this phrase is slightly different. There is no particle ha, read wa. Ohayou comes from the word hayai, which means being early. So literally you're saying it's early, but of course what you mean is good morning. Now, ohayou gozaimasu is the polite way of saying good morning. If you want to make it more casual, just get rid of gozaimasu at the end, which gives ohayou, ohayou, Ohayo. Make sure to remember that last bit, gozaimasu. 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 Because almost every time you'll see it, you'll just need to get rid of it to go from formal to casual. It literally means there is or it is. Now, if you watched my video about hiragana, I explained that some characters could be devocalized depending on their position or the character that follows. Because I've seen learners with an intermediate level correct beginners or even trying to correct teachers saying that devocalizing it is the proper pronunciation. But it's not necessarily true. The kana is su. So if you really wanted to be proper, you would say Ohayo gozaimasu. That would actually sound even more polite. But yes, 95% of the time people tend to devocalize it, even in formal settings, so you'll sound more natural saying gozaimasu instead of gozaimasu. Good night is not really a greeting phrase, but I thought I'd still add it. Oyasumi nasai. Oyasumi nasai. Oyasumi nasai. Now one thing to keep in mind is that in Japanese, the longer it is, the more polite it's going to sound. In oyasumi, the o is the honorific prefix. Yasumi comes from the verb yasumu, meaning to rest, and nasai means please do so. Please rest well. Oyasumi nasai. If you want to be casual, just get rid of nasai, which makes oyasumi. 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 Now, speaking of informal greetings, let's see how you can say hi to your friends of the same age or younger. Yo, which already sounds familiar in English. Yo. Another one that I sometimes personally use is os or uis. When I was younger, I thought it was a reduction of ohayo gozaimasu. Ohayo gozaimasu. Os. Ois. But later on, I heard another theory that it actually came from karate. Something else you should know about the Japanese society is that even though gender roles tend to be more flexible over time, the same can be said about the language. Some words and speech styles sound more manly, while others sound more feminine. This interjection is only for men. Os, uis. And I don't know if you noticed, but I took the lowest voice to make it sound even more manly. Os, uis. So now if you want to sound more girly or simply cuter, you could say Yahoo! Yahoo! I'm not sure about the origin of this word. Does it come from Mario Kart? Yahoo! Anyway, just know that it exists if you ever hear it. To sum it up in a neutral or formal context, we'll say Ohayo gozaimasu in the morning, konnichiwa in the afternoon, and konbanwa in the evening. In a casual context, you'll say Ohayo in the morning or Yo! Yo! At any time of the day. You could be more manly by using os or uis or a friendly vibe with yahoo. Do you remember how to say greetings? If you don't, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Forgetting is also part of the learning. You'll have to frequently review everything you've studied, and bit by bit, it's going to stick to your long-term memory. Greetings is aisatsu. Aisatsu. And now that we saw how to say hello, let's learn what to say when you introduce yourself. When you meet someone for the first time, you'll start by saying hajimemashite. Hajimemashite. Hajimemashite, which literally means it's the first time, so you're just acknowledging that fact. Make sure you've never seen that person before, because a friend of mine met a girl in a club and fate made them meet again as he started his first day in a new job. Apparently her makeup was so different that he didn't recognize her, so when he said hajimemashite, she got upset. So there is a second way to express nice to meet you in Japanese, which is douzo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Douzo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Douzo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Douzo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Douzo could be translated to please. Now, yoroshiku is a bit of a magical phrase that has several meanings. In this case, it means something like take good care of me. Here, the e sound can be devocalized, so yoroshiku becomes yoroshiku. Incidentally, yoroshi means good. Yoroshi desu ka means is it good in a very polite way. Yoroshi desu ka? Yoroshi desu ka? Yoroshi desu ka? Onegai shimasu is another way to say please. Onegai literally means a request or a favor, and shimasu is from the verb suru, which means to do or to make. If you really need to distinguish douzo and onegai shimasu, douzo is like please go ahead, as in kochira douzo, this way please, or hai douzo, here please take this. Whereas onegai shimasu is more please, in the sense would you please do that for me? Sometimes it can even mean I'm begging you, onegai dakara. Okay, so now that you've remembered this sentence, douzo yoroshiku onegai shimasu, keep in mind that it's used in very formal exchanges. And if you want to be even more polite, you may replace shimasu by itashimasu. Itashimasu, so yoroshiku onegai itashimasu. And since onegai and itashimasu respectively end and start with the same vowel, they're going to merge. Onegai itashimasu. Onegai itashimasu becomes onegai itashimasu. But this is very polite and perhaps too polite in most contexts. So So I would use this level of politeness when I deal with Japanese clients or VIPs. So that was the hard part. Now in a slightly less formal context, you could skip the dozo and simply say よろしくお願いします。よろしくお願いします。よろしくお願いします。This is actually the most common way to use the phrase. If you're an American tourist and you're hired a Japanese guide, or if you start taking lessons, you could say that to your teacher. よろしくお願いします。So I said that you could get rid of どうぞ to make よろしくお願いします。Well, you could also get rid of お願いします, which makes どうぞよろしく。どうぞよろしく。どうぞよろしく。どうぞよろしく. Now, just keep in mind that the longer it is, the more polite it's going to be. But in a neutral context, you could definitely use どうぞよろしく. Alright, now in a casual setting, you could only keep よろしく、よろしく、よろしく. And if you meet someone who's clearly younger than you and you feel like you're gonna like, you could add a little ね at the end to add a little complicity. よろしくね、よろしくね、よろしくね. So as I mentioned, the shorter it is, the more casual it's going to sound. So let's review all the expressions we learned. どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。どうぞよろしくお願いします。よろしくお願いします。どうぞよろしく、よろしく、よろしくね. I know it's a lot to process, and if you had to only pick one, I would say you can't go wrong with the standard neutral よろしくお願いします, which is still polite. Now, what to reply if the other person says it first? Or you could simply say よろしくお願いします. But one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that you don't always repeat what the other person says. Always ask yourself, where are you in the hierarchy? If your boss, who's much older than you, says よろしくね, you can't repeat よろしくね. You'll have to show respect and say どうぞよろしくお願いします or よろしくお願いします. Now, if you absolutely want to have a reply version after someone said it to you, you could say こちらこそよろしくお願いします. こちらこそよろしくお願いします. こちら literally means this side, where I am. So my side. And it's a polite way to talk about yourself. こそ is a bit difficult to literally translate, but in this context it means me too. Now, よろしくお願いします usually starts a relationship, so you'll use it in most common interactions. But what if you finally meet your favorite celebrity? You could say お会いできて光栄です. 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 The first word starts with o, which is the same as in onegai, we just saw, the honorific prefix. Ai comes from the verb au, which means to meet. Dekite means to be able. Koe means honor. And here you have to be careful because it's two long vowels. It's not kouei or koe, which means voice. It's koe, koe desu. Desu, here we could translate it to it is. So literally, it is an honor to be able to meet, implying you. Another expression is 会えて嬉しいです. 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 会えて is the same as お会いできて. It's slightly less formal. 嬉しい means to be happy. 嬉しい. And again, we have です. So literally, the entire sentence means happy to have been able to meet. By now, you should have probably noticed that we didn't literally use me and you. That's because when the subject of a sentence is obvious, we could get rid of it. And it's not very polite to directly say you in this context. When you're saying nice to meet you, it's pretty obvious what's happening. So let's now recap the main phrases we studied to say nice to meet you. はじめまして。よろしくお願いします。お会いできて光栄です。会えて嬉しいです。Now, the order in which you'll use them is first, just like in English, you'll start by saying hello, konnichiwa, and then you'll acknowledge the fact that it's the first time you meet, はじめまして. Then you'll say your name, which we'll study in a second, and you can end the introduction with よろしくお願いします or お会いできて光栄です. So in my case, I would say こんにちは、はじめまして、高秀です. よろしくお願いします. Alright, so now let's see how you can give your name. Literally, my name is would be 私の名前は your name, and then です. So with my name, it'd be 私の名前は高秀です. 私 means I. No is the possessive particle. It's like of in English. So 私の together makes my. 名前 sounds similar to its English translation name, 名前. Then we have the topic particle wa that we already studied. Then you give your name, make sure to adapt it in katakana so that it's easier for Japanese people to pronounce, followed by the final desu, or this. So you can already see that the place of each word in the sentence is very different from English. Literally, it's me of name, Takahide, it is. Now, do you remember when I said that in Japanese we could get rid of the subject when it's obvious? Well, most of the time when you're introducing yourself, it will be obvious. So you could simply say, 名前は, then your name, followed by desu. 名前は高秀です. Now here is a little variation that we also have in English. Instead of saying my name is Taka, I could also say I am Taka. So we could definitely replace 名前は by 私は. 私は高秀です. And again, since we can get rid of the subject when it's obvious, we could also get rid of 私は and only keep the final です. In my case, 高秀です. Now, because we've pretty much removed everything in the sentence, let me quickly go back to the syntax. In Japanese, it's subject that you can get rid of when it's obvious, and then we have the object, and finally, the verb. And of course, the longer the sentence, the trickier it gets. I'm not trying to scare you here, but it's good to keep in mind as early as possible, because it's one of the biggest challenges for English speakers. Now, in a more formal conversation, you could give your name followed by と申します. 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 高秀と申します. Now, keep in mind that in Japanese, we give our last name before our first name, just so you know when they introduce yourself to you. So let's pretend your name is Sherlock Holmes. You would normally say, ホームズ・シャーロックと申します. ホームズ・シャーロックと申します. As you can see, transforming a foreign name into Japanese make it sound very different. So if you could adapt yours, it's going to be easier for them to pronounce and remember. Now, in case they're confused, I'll also teach you how to say first name and last name. So family name in Japanese is 名字. 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 So say your last name followed by が名字です. So we already saw wa or ha read wa as the topic particle. They have a similar grammatical role, but they're slightly different. In some cases, you'll have to use one and not the other. In other cases, they'll be interchangeable. There are actually theses about the difference between the two particles. But this is a course for absolute beginners, so I don't want to make it too confusing, but just know that they exist, and the more you'll listen to Japanese, the more you'll get used to it. So myoji. Myoji means family name. And then we have this to end the sentence politely. So for example, Holmes ga myoji desu. And for our first name, we could use namae. But to be even more precise, we'll say shita no namae. Shita no namae. Shita no namae. Shita means down or below. No is the possessive particle. So together it literally means lower name. That's because traditionally Japanese used to be written vertically, and the first name was below the last name. Now, if you want to combine the two sentences, just skip the final su in the first one. That gives ポッターが名字で、ハリーが下の名前です. My family name is Potter, and my first name is Harry. And by replacing the final su with a comma, you can technically combine as many sentences as you want. Alright, so let's recap the main sentences we've studied to give your name. 名前は高秀です. 上坂高秀です。上坂高秀と申します。上坂が名字です。高秀が下の名前です。Now, most of the time where both parties introduce themselves, you wouldn't need to, but just in case, let's see how you can ask someone's name. If you ask Google Translate, it's going to give you あなたの名前は何ですか? 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 It's not grammatically wrong. あなた means you. No is the possessive particle. We know 名前 and again は the topic particle to finish with ですか. So we know です and by adding か we make it a question. But in reality, you would never use that expression unless you speak to a 5-year-old kid. Why is that? Well, as mentioned, when a subject is obvious, we'll get rid of it. But there is another reason. In Japanese, saying you is way too direct. Do you remember こちら we used in こちらこそ? Well, a polite way to say you is そちら, そちら, which, you guessed it, literally means your side or your direction. そちら. So you could definitely say そちらのお名前は何ですか? 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 And we added a little honorific prefix o before 名前 to be more polite. But if we can get rid of the trouble of finding a suitable way to say you, let's take it. It even makes it easier for you. So without そちら, it makes お名前は何ですか? お名前は何ですか? As mentioned, it's not considered very polite to be direct and being firm in your sentences. I know it's very difficult for American people because we're educated quite the opposite way, but in Japan you don't want to force your opinion or thoughts on other people. And so, not finishing sentences follows that logic. It's very common, it's going to make you sound more natural, and it's a way for Japanese people to somehow feel connected with each other, even if obviously we might not have the same views. So the most natural way to ask is simply お名前は? 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 And leave a silence. I know that in English, it might sound awkward, but trust me, in Japanese, it's considered polite. Now, what to do in a situation where you don't have any choice but to say you? Well, if you go to Japan, you'll notice that people call each other by their name. Usually, the last name followed by san which we could definitely translate to Mr. or Ms. But keep in mind that in Japanese, it's a suffix and it should be placed after the name. So let's say you meet an adult called Uzumaki Naruto. You'll be calling that person Uzumaki-san. Uzumaki-san. And the thing is, even if you don't speak Japanese, just calling a Japanese acquaintance or client with the suffix san would show that you know a little bit about their culture and they'll appreciate the effort. So if you want to say, what about you to Mr. Naruto Uzumaki, you would say, Uzumaki-san wa, Uzumaki-san wa. I know it sounds a bit weird in English, but it's 100% natural in Japanese. If you're speaking to a child, you can skip the san and just say the first name. Naruto wa? Naruto wa? Now let's learn how to share where we come from. And just like in English, there are two main ways to say that. I come from Canada and I am Canadian. Let's start with I come from. You'll first give the country you're originally from, followed by kara kimashita. Kara kimashita. Kara kimashita. Kara means from, and kimashita is the past tense of kuru, which means to come. So literally, come from. Again, we noticed that I didn't use the pronoun I here. And of course, you could start the sentence with watashi wa. It's grammatically correct, because I know it's frustrating for us English speakers to skip the pronoun, but not only will you sound way more natural by skipping subjects when they're obvious, saying watashi wa too often could give the impression that you're self-centered. So keep it simple. So if you're from the States, you'll say, Amerika kara kimashita. Amerika kara kimashita. Amerika kara kimashita. Unfortunately, even though there are more than 30 countries in the American continent, Japan has been heavily influenced by the USA, in the sense that America is more often used to talk about the country rather than the continent. Now let me give you a few countries to practice with, and because I can't go over all the countries in the world, you can use Google Translate for the rest. It works well for isolated words. I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but from the previous parts we already saw that it's more natural to get rid of the subject when it's obvious, that the place of each word in a sentence is not the same as in English, and that the level of politeness and formality is very important. That's too many variables for Google to give you a natural translation that would match your context. But yeah, so we have Canada. Canada for Canada. That one is very easy. France, France, France for France. And then Spain, Spain for Spain. So if I want to say I come from Canada, Canada kara kimashita. Canada kara kimashita. If I want to say I come from France, France kara kimashita. France kara kimashita. Now, here are some interesting ones. We have Igiris, Igiris, Igiris for England, and then we have Deutsch for Germany, because it comes from Deutsch. Deutsch, Deutsch. Now, for Asian countries, it gets a little trickier because we'll use kanji, the Chinese characters. So for Japan, it's Nihon, Nihon, Nihon. There is a variation which is Nippon. Actually, Nippon sounds slightly more patriotic, and you might hear it more in sports or political events. But when Japanese people say, I come from Japan, they'll use Nihon. Nihon kara kimashita. Nihon kara kimashita. Nihon kara kimashita. Nihon kara kimashita. Ni is the character for sun, and Hon is the origin, which makes the origin of the sun, pretty close to its English nickname, the land of the rising sun. China is Chugoku. 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 Be careful with the long vowel, chu. Chu means middle, and goku is country. So literally, the middle country or the central country. Korea is Kankoku. 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 And it means the country of the Kan people. So that was how to say I come from. But let's say you're originally from another country, or your parents come from a different country, and you don't identify with the country you were born in, you'll be saying the name of the country followed by jin desu. Jin desu. Jin, which by itself is read hito, is the character for human or person. And again, desu, which is the neutrally polite way to state a fact. So let's say you want to say I'm American. That would be Amerikajin desu. Amerikajin desu. Amerikajin desu. I am English. Igirisujin desu. Could you guess how to say I am Japanese? Nihonjin desu. Nihonjin desu. Nihonjin desu. Now, if you want to be more precise and say I was born, you'll say the name of the country followed by de umaremashita. De umaremashita. De is the particle used to indicate the place where an action or event take place. Umaremashita is the past tense of the verb umareru, which means to be born, or more literally, to be given birth. If you want to say born and raised, it's going to be umare mo sodachi mo. Umare mo sodachi mo, the name of the country, or the city, followed by, you know it, des. 生まれも育ちもパリです。生まれも育ちもパリです。生まれも育ちもパリです。Mo here is the particle to say also. So literally, it would be closer to born and also raised. The conjugation here is slightly different. 生まれ and 育ち in these forms make them nouns. If you were born in a country and you grew up in a different one, you would say the name of your birthplace, followed by 生まれで, then the name of the place you grew up, followed by 育ちです. So even if you're American, if your family has been moving around, you could say, I was born in New York, but I grew up in LA. ニューヨーク生まれでロサンゼルス育ちです。ニューヨーク生まれでロサンゼルス育ちです。ニューヨーク生まれでロサンゼルス育ちです。If you're born and raised in the same place and you want to keep it simple, you could also use 出身です。出身です。出身です。Watch the double consonant 出身. It's not 出身, it's 出身. The first character, 出 is to leave or exit, and 身 is the character for body. So if you want to say, I'm originally from the Kansai area in Japan, you would say, 関西出身です。関西出身です。So let's now recap the main sentences to express where you come from. アメリカから来ました。アメリカ人です。アメリカで生まれました。アメリカ生まれでカナダ育ちです。アメリカ出身です。Now let's ask the question, where are you from? In order to do that, we'll simply take what we already learned and make it a question. So the question is, どこから来ましたか?どこから来ましたか?どこから来ましたか? どこ is the word for where. から来ました you already know. And the final ka makes it a question. And just like in English, this sentence can be confusing because it could literally mean, where did you just come from? Normally with the context, the person you're speaking to should understand what you mean, but note that they could reply, I just came in from the back door. I would say that どこから来ました is a rather neutral sentence. If you want to be more polite, you could say どちらからいらっしゃいましたか?どちらからいらっしゃいましたか?どちらからいらっしゃいましたか? This sentence means exactly the same thing. We just replaced a few words with more polite ones. So どこ becomes どちら、どちら. Kara stays the same, but 来ました becomes いらっしゃいました. If you've been to Japan and you went to a restaurant there, as you should, you might be familiar with all the staff shouting いらっしゃいませ, いらっしゃいませ. That's exactly the same verb, and it's the polite way to say come in. We also saw how to give your nationality with 人, and the question for that would be 何人ですか?何人ですか?何人ですか?何人ですか? If you watch anime, you probably already know that nani means what. So what nationality are you? But to be honest with you, I don't really recommend using that expression when you're asking someone directly because it sounds a little too direct to be polite. But you could use it when you speak about someone else who's not part of the conversation. あの人何人ですか?あの人何人ですか?あの人何人ですか?あの人 means that person over there. So what's that person's nationality? In order to avoid any confusion with the proper level of formality, I personally prefer asking the question with 出身. So in the most polite way, you should ask ご出身はどちらですか?ご出身はどちらですか?ご出身はどちらですか? Here we added the honorific prefix ご in front of 出身 to make it more polite. You don't use it when you talk about yourself, but you would use it to show respect to the person you're speaking with. And just like we saw with お名前は, you could definitely do the same with this sentence and simply say ご出身は、ご出身は、ご出身は, and leave a silence. So let's now recap the main sentence to ask where are you from? どこから来ましたか?どちらからいらっしゃいましたか?何人ですか?ご出身はどちらですか?ご出身は? Now let's see how to say bye in Japanese. If you look it up on the internet, you'll probably find さようなら, さようなら, さようなら. Or sometimes you also hear it with a short yo, さよなら, さよなら. And most of the people here in the US know this expression because it's been popularized in movies and TV shows, just like hasta la vista, which incidentally is also not the first way to say bye among Spanish speakers. But my point is, if you do use it, try not to pronounce it the American way. You might be used to sayonara, but it's sayonara. And the reason why it's not often used in Japan is because it implies that you're not going to see the other person again, whether it's because you're not planning to, which is rude, or because fate might choose otherwise. So let me teach you a more natural way to say it, which is 失礼します。失礼します。失礼します。And this is actually two in one because it actually means excuse me. Excuse me. 失礼 means being impolite, and します is the conjugation of suru, which means to do or to make. Actually, it means more than just that. The more you learn Japanese, the more you'll learn verbs and adjectives with suru. So you should get used to it and its conjugations. So 失礼します, you're literally saying, I'm being impolite, meaning, may I be excused? Or would you excuse me? This is also the most common way to say bye when hanging up the phone. And it's actually pretty funny because in phone calls, it's rude to be the first one to hang up. So you'll see people repeat it like 3 or 4 times. はい、失礼します。はい、失礼します。はい、失礼します。はい、失礼します。If you are in a social context or at work and you're leaving the group, you might want to add お先に、お先に、お先に. Here, お先 means before. Ni is the spatio-temporal particle. So basically, you're saying something like, excuse me for leaving before you all. お先に失礼します。お先に失礼します. Speaking of working environments, you'll hear colleagues say, お疲れ様でした。お疲れ様でした。お疲れ様でした。お疲れ様でした. Sometimes as a parting phrase. お is the honorific prefix. 疲れ means fatigue. Sama is the honorific suffix, and deshita is the past tense of desu. So literally, you acknowledge the fact that it's been a hard-working day. Time to go home. お疲れ様でした. And actually, when you meet your colleagues during the day, you can use it in the present tense to greet them. So that's お疲れ様です。お疲れ様です. Literally, we're working hard. If you're the boss and you're older than your employees, you can skip the deshita or desu and simply say お疲れ、お疲れ、お疲れ. So if it's too rude to literally say bye, what do Japanese people say? Well, just like in English, it's something closer to see you. So here we have それではまた. それではまた. それでは is like, well then, and mata in this context means again, implying see you again. It's like when you say bye then. それではまた. Now, if you want to adapt that for a more casual context, では becomes じゃあ, じゃあ, which makes それじゃあまた. 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 And if you want to sound a bit more intimate, you can add the exclamation suffix ね at the very end, which makes それじゃあまたね. 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 And if you're very close to the person, you can get rid of それ, which makes じゃあまたね. 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 And the ultimate contraction would be to also remove じゃ or また, which makes either またね or じゃあね. またね. じゃあね. Now, as I said, the USA had a great influence on modern Japanese, and in a casual context, a lot of people would simply say bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. Now, if you're living with people and you're leaving your home in the morning, you'll say 行ってきます, 行ってきます, 行ってきます. 行って comes from the verb 行く, which means to go, and 来ます from the verb 来る, meaning to come. So literally, you're saying, I'm going and coming back. 行ってきます. If you're the one staying at home, you'll reply, 行ってらっしゃい。行ってらっしゃい。行ってらっしゃい. Watch the double consonant here. 行ってらっしゃい。行ってらっしゃい. And it simply means go and come back. Now, when you come back home, you'll say, ただいま。ただいま。ただいま. Which literally means just now. And just like こんにちは, it comes from an entire sentence. ただいま帰りました。ただいま帰りました。ただいま帰りました. Meaning, I just came back. It's also a good way to check if there is anybody home. And if you're the one at home, you can reply, おかえりなさい。おかえりなさい。おかえりなさい. And it means, welcome back. おかえりなさい. Or simply, おかえり。おかえり。おかえり. O is the honorific prefix, and kaeri means return. So literally, you're just saying, return. That's how you say bye in Japanese. Now, let's recap. さようなら or さようなら。失礼します。それではまた。じゃあね。またね. And when you're leaving and coming back home, 行ってきます。バイバイ。行ってらっしゃい。ただいま。おかえりなさい。おかえり. Now let's learn how to say please. We actually learned it in the magical sentence よろしくお願いします. お願いします is the general way to say please when you ask for a favor. お願いします。お願いします. Again, in a casual setting, just drop します to only keep お願い。お願い。お願い. If you want to request an action or a specific object, you'll ask the object in question followed by ください。ください。ください. So for example, if you want to ask for water, you would say お水ください。お水ください。お水ください. O is the honorific prefix and mizu means water. In a casual context, replace ください by ちょうだい. So if you want to say give me rice or give me a bowl of rice, you'll say ご飯ちょうだい。 gohan chodai. Here again, the go in front of gohan is honorific, so by now you can tell that there is respect towards things like food in Japan. It's good to know that part of the culture, and it goes without saying that you shouldn't be playing with your food. This brings me to the next phrase, which is itadakimasu. 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 If you watch anime, you might already know this one. It's usually said before eating a meal. But not only. It comes from the verb itadaku, which means to humbly accept or receive. So you can also use it when you receive a gift. Actually, just another cultural note here. In Japan, when you receive a gift, the etiquette wants you to refuse at least once or twice. The last one is when you want to invite someone to do something. And we actually saw that one. It's dozo, dozo, dozo. So if you want to say please sit down, it's going to be dozo osuari kudasai. Dozo osuari kudasai. Dozo osuari kudasai. So again, the honorific prefix o followed by suari, which means sitting, and you notice that the sentence ends with kudasai. So to recap the different ways to say please, onegai shimasu, or onegai, kudasai, chodai, dozo. Now let's learn how to say thank you. We'll start with the longest version, which is doumo arigatou gozaimasu. Doumo arigatou gozaimasu. Doumo arigatou gozaimasu. You can't go wrong with this one. It's very polite and you can use it in pretty much every situation where you need to show your appreciation. Now that you've done the hardest part, let's see how we can play with this phrase. Now, because it's pretty long, the most common way would be to remove doumo and simply keep arigatou gozaimasu. Arigatou gozaimasu. Arigatou gozaimasu. Watch out, because sometimes I hear people say it so fast that it sounds like azas, azas, arigatou gozaimasu, azas. Now, some people might also hear arigatou gozaimashita when they're leaving a restaurant, for example. They'll just remember it like that and repeat it as is. Arigatou gozaimashita is the past tense of arigatou gozaimasu, and they each have a proper timing. So when you're leaving a restaurant, waiters thank you for your visit and the food you ate, which is in the past. But when you receive a gift, make sure to show your appreciation in the present tense. Arigatou gozaimasu. In a casual context, you don't need to worry about that because you can just get rid of the final gozaimasu or gozaimashita and simply say arigatou, arigatou, arigatou. Another short way to say thank you, which is more polite than simply arigatou, is to keep only the first part. Doumo, doumo, doumo. If you want to say thank you so much, you may say 本当にありがとうございます。本当にありがとうございます。本当にありがとうございます。Or 本当にありがとう。本当に means really. And as you can hear, I'm really insisting when I'm saying it, so use it for very big gifts or services. Another very natural way to say thank you is to actually say sorry, which is すみません。すみません。すみません。It comes from the verb sumu, meaning being enough or to be complete. I would usually use that one with an act of service, like a waiter at the restaurant pouring water. すいません. And as you can probably hear, sumi gets reduced quite easily, and so most of the time you'll hear or say すいません。すいません。すいません instead of すみません. Then we have 感謝します。感謝します。感謝します. Now, this expression is the equivalent of I'm grateful in English, so you'll usually use it in a speech. Kansha means gratitude. And you see, by adding shimasu from the verb suru, it makes it a verb. Now, if you want to sound cool or cute, you can just use the one borrowed from English, but make sure to adapt your accent to Japanese. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Just a little note about linguistic diversity in Japan. If you visit the Kansai area, which you should, that's where Osaka and Kyoto are located, you might encounter people saying おおきに Okini, okini, to say thank you. It's good to know if you want to impress the locals. We saw itadakimasu before starting your meal, and after finishing it, you'll say ごちそうさまでした。ごちそうさまでした。ごちそうさまでした. And that one you'll only use with food. So we have go and sama, the honorific affixes. ごちそう means a treat or a feast, and deshita is the past tense of desu. So you're literally saying it was a feast. And it's a way to thank the cook for the meal. So let's recap the main ways to say thank you. どうもありがとうございます。ありがとうございます。ありがとうございました。本当にありがとうございます。ありがとう。すみません。or すいません。感謝します。いただきます。ごちそうさまでした。So here are different ways to receive credits, or not, because many ways to express that is actually to refuse the thanks. So first we have いえいえ。いえいえ。Yeah, which literally means no, no. I guess we wouldn't logically need to say no twice, but it's now part of the cultural way to speak. And actually some people say it 4 times. Yeah. Another is to say don't worry about it, which is 気にしないで. 気にしないで、気にしないで. Ki in this case means the attention. Ni is the particle, and shinai is the negative form of suru in the present tense. De is the type of conjugation. Because again, it's the shortened version of a bigger sentence, which is 気にしないでください or 気にしないでくれ that you could use just like that, but it sounds as natural to just say 気にしないで, 気にしないで. Another way that we also use in English is it's nothing. In Japanese, we say とんでもないです。とんでもないです。とんでもないです。In a casual conversation, just skip this and simply say とんでもない。とんでもない。とんでもない。Nah, that's nothing. Don't mention it. The great thing is that you can combine these with いえいえ and say いえいえとんでもないです or いえいえ気にしないで. You're gonna sound so natural saying that in Japanese. You might know that Japan is very big on gifts. If not, you should see how much effort they put in wrapping them. So when you give a present and the other person likes it, you can say よかった。よかった。よかった. Yokatta is the past tense of yoi, which means to be good or great. Though in English it's a bit weird to say it was great when the other person shows that you got the perfect gift. In Japanese, it's used to say glad you like it. Now, how to say you're welcome? The standard way you'll probably learn in textbook is どういたしまして。どういたしまして。どういたしまして. But as you can hear, it's pretty long, and so it's usually going to be an informal exchange. Still good to know though. So let's recap the main ways to say you're welcome. どういたしまして。いえいえ、気にしないで。とんでもないです。Now let's see how to say yes in Japanese. The most standard way to say it is はい。はい。はい。It's formal, but you'll hear it all the time. And be careful with this one because it means more than just yes. For example, when people didn't hear you or didn't quite understand your point, they'll also say はい as in what? It's all in the intonation. And I guess it's a more polite way to say 何? はい? Now, we also use it to show that we're listening to you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we agree. Usually, this type of hi will be repeated a couple of times like this. Hi, 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 hi. So when in doubt, especially if you're doing business with Japanese people, don't take hi as a definite yes. In a more casual conversation, you can replace hi by But to be honest, first will almost always be very light. And sometimes you won't even be able to hear it. Some people will use But you know what? If you really want to be lazy, you could just open your mouth and make a sound which is going to sound like Now, in English, we might not realize it, but we use yes in so many different contexts, and hi will be applicable in most of them. But as we saw, sometimes you need to be more precise. For instance, if you want to say that's right or that's correct, you'll say そうです。そうです。そうです. You can actually combine it with はい, which makes it はい、そうです。はい、そうです。はい、そうです。If you want to make it casual, replace です by だ or simply remove it and replace はい by そうだ。そうだ。そう。If you want to emphasize on the fact that you understand the message, you can say わかりました。わかりました。わかりました。which literally means understood. わかりました. If you're a client in a restaurant, you might hear the humble form, which is かしこまりました。かしこまりました。かしこまりました. In a professional context, you might also hear 了解です。了解です。了解です. which is closer to the English Roger or got it. Otherwise, you can use the universal okay, but with a Japanese accent. Okay. Okay. So there's a double consonant and it doesn't end with the E sound. Okay. But it's a long vowel. Okay. When we need to be polite, we'll even add desu at the end, making okay desu. Okay desu. Of course is もちろん. もちろん. To which you can also add this if you want to be more polite. もちろんです. 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 So let's recap the main ways to say yes. はい。そうです or そう。了解です or 了解。わかりました or かしこまりました. Now, how to say no in Japanese? The standard way you'll find in textbook is いいえ。いいえ。いいえ. Sometimes we'll remove one e, just like we saw to say you're welcome. Yeah. Another variation of いえ is いや. Yeah, and we use that more like an interjection to say no. Yeah, the word exists, but as I said, it's culturally rude to be direct, and so we tend to diplomatically find ways to make the other person understand that we're refusing. So for example, we saw そうです to say that's right. The opposite is そうじゃない. そうじゃない. And you could add いや before, which is going to make you sound more natural. いや、そうじゃない. いや、そうじゃない. や、そうじゃない. It goes without saying that giving your opinion like that would definitely be in a casual conversation. Another natural way to say that's wrong, in the sense that this fact is incorrect, is 違う, 違う, 違う. To which again you could add いや、違う, いや、違う, いや、違う. いや, when it's not used as a negating interjection, means that you don't want something because you don't like, or worse, because you find it disgusting. So you'll hear やだ, 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 which is typically what a girl who's not interested in a guy, or a difficult child who doesn't want to eat his vegetables. やだ. You know, it's funny and it's going to be very subtle, but we use to say yes, but we use to say no. So here it's all in the intonation. So I know I said that in the Japanese culture we tend not to be direct, but you know, there are situations where you don't have any other choice. So a rather polite way to be direct is 結構です. 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 Now, if you're trespassing, if you're smoking somewhere you're not allowed to, or if you're just not following the rules in general, Japanese people will tell you, in a polite way, but they will tell you. And the way to say that is ダメです. 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 It's like you can't or you're not allowed to. Now let's recap the main ways to say no. いいえ、や、やだ、違う、結構です、ダメです or ダメ. Now let's see a few ways to say sorry. We already saw 失礼します to say excuse me when leaving, but you can use it every time you're disturbing or interrupting someone. If you want to use this expression to apologize, you'll have to conjugate it in the past tense, which makes 失礼しました、失礼しました、失礼しました. We also saw すいません as a way to say thank you, but as it literally means sorry, of course, you can use it for that too. And just like 失礼します, you can use the past tense, すいませんでした、すいませんでした、すいませんでした. So what's the difference between すいません and 失礼します? Well, they can be interchangeable in most cases, but if you're unsure, keep in mind their literal meaning. すいません is when your deliberate action led to an incident, or if you feel like you didn't do enough to prevent something bad from happening. 失礼します or 失礼しました is more something unintentional, but you apologize because you realize you caused trouble. When more serious damage was done and you need to formally apologize for that, the most polite way would be 申し訳ありません。申し訳ありません。申し訳ありません. This is rather formal. A more neutral way to apologize is ごめんなさい。ごめんなさい。ごめんなさい. In a casual setting, you can remove なさい and it makes ごめん。ごめん。ごめん. And if you're talking to someone way younger, you could add the affectionate particle ね at the end. ごめんね. 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 I've heard young people use the reverse slang めんご. めんご. But to be honest with you, not showing respect to the language kind of says it all. It would be difficult to take such an apology seriously, so I recommend not using it. In an intimate context, where you did something really wrong, like lying to your girlfriend, it might still sound too formal, or the opposite, not strong enough, or just weird to say ごめんなさい. So in this case, we would use 悪かった. 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 It comes from the adjective 悪い, which means bad. So basically, I was bad, meaning I'm to blame or it's my fault. It might not seem like an apology at first, but what matters in this situation is how the other person feels, and if you trust them, well, it should count as an apology. So let's recap the main ways to say sorry. 失礼しました。すいませんでした。申し訳ありません。ごめんなさい。悪かった。Now let's learn some affectionate words in Japanese, and I was thinking about starting with I love you. It's funny because in Japan, being too emotional shows that you're not in control of yourself, but this doesn't mean that Japanese people don't feel anything. In fact, it's quite the opposite, but we channel our emotional energy into arts. Whereas in the USA, people tend to be overly emotional. They give high fives and hugs to everybody, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but think about it, we use the word love for pretty much everything. I love food. I love you, man. I love this language course. But we make a big deal when it's about saying it to our romantic partner. So it's very subtle and it doesn't make it easier for English learners. Now in Japanese, we have different words for that. The universal love is ai. 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 And if you want to say I love you, Google Translate is probably going to give you 愛してる. 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 But this is really intense, way more than when we say it in English in a romantic relationship. When we talk about romantic love, there is the word koi. 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 So you could definitely say koi suru to say being in love or falling in love. Koi suru. And koi is also the one you'll use to talk about your girlfriend or boyfriend. We'll say koibito. koibito, which literally means loved person. Actually, you can put koi and I together and it becomes renai, which is the passionate love. But the more natural way to say it among young people in their honeymoon phase is suki. Suki. Ski. So here you can devocalize the u in su, ski, just like skiing, ski, or ski desu, if you want to be polite. It might sound weird to you, but if the person you like is older than you, it's not uncommon to stay polite towards that person in the way you speak and throughout the whole relationship, actually. And if you want to say, I really like you, you can say, daisuki desu, daisuki desu, daisuki desu, or daisuki. Now, another affectionate word is aitai, 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 which is the equivalent of I miss you, but it literally means I want to meet you. It's from the verb au, meaning to meet, and conjugated with the Tai form, which makes want to meet. And again, the context makes it obvious that you are missing the person you're talking to. So here is how it works. If you've been going out with a person for a couple of months or a year, you'd say suki or daisuki, or with this, suki desu, daisuki desu. And then during the relationship, if your romantic partner is away, you can say aitai, aitai desu. Then after a couple of years of ups and downs, you get married. Well, you could say aishiteru at that time, but I feel like you still need to prove yourself. So wait until your wife is pregnant and she goes through the process of giving life. You go through many more years of hardship, and then you can say aishiteru. But at that point, you understand each other so well that you don't even need to say it. Thank you so much for watching this entire video. I hope you enjoyed this little introduction to the Japanese language. So please keep in mind the level of formality, getting rid of anything that's obvious from the context, and also the differences with the North American mindset, which involves, for example, being direct. If you found this helpful, please let me know with a thumbs up or in the comments. And don't forget to share and subscribe for more content like this. じゃあまたね!